Who is God? What is God? How is God God? Big questions for the first Sunday of Lent. Within the pages of the Bible, there's an ongoing debate about God. Different books of the Bible and their different authors project individual views of God and of the way that God acts in the world. And that should come as no surprise to us, since whatever else the Bible is, it began as a collection of people's reflections on God. I'm not saying that's all the Bible is, because quite clearly over a period, the church threw out those writings which they didn't find to have an insight concerning God, or had an application as to how the people should live their lives. And so what we have is a very special collection of writings, but there's still a collection which contain more than one viewpoint about God. You've only got to ask yourself, why have we got 4 Gospels instead of 1 to see that that's true? There are some issues that come up over and over throughout the Bible. Big questions that different writers wrestle with in different ways. And one of these questions is about the nature and extent of God's power. And another is about how that power is to be understood in light of the evil in the world. And these are the questions that push a bit more into our consciousness during the season of Lent, because the stories we read at this time of year show a God who doesn't simply obliterate evil, but becomes a victim of it. We see Jesus, the Son of God, choosing either not to use that power or being simply powerless in the face of evil. And so we must ask, what kind of God is this? So Lent is not about giving up. It's about taking on the challenge of asking that question. And that's why our reading from Genesis today, it's not just a story for the children to paint rainbows and animals and an ark. It's the conclusion of the story of Noah's flood. And the writer of this story attributes absolute power to God. God made the flood to deal with the problem of evil in the world. God responds to evil by wiping it out with a mighty act of power. But we may need to question the author's interpretation of God's actions. You see, in this part of the story, God is promising that he will never again send a flood that destroys the earth in such a way. And did God keep his promise? Well, if you're anxious to defend God's honour, you could argue that there has never been another flood like that one. But there's been a fair few that seemed very close to it. Now, you can't escape the fact there are parts of the Bible, some parts that push the view of God as one with absolute power, who is the controller of everything that occurs in the world, floods and earthquakes, and pandemics included. But this is not a view that can go unchallenged in the light of God as seen in Jesus Christ. The story of Jesus alone in the wilderness is not an image of God exercising control over the forces of nature. Here we have Jesus spending days alone, feeling lost, hungry, tempted to give up, change track, and struggling with questions like whether the way of power can ever be reconciled with the way of love, And when Jesus emerges from the wilderness and begins his mission, the shadow of powerlessness of the cross hangs over him right from the start, because as Mark points out, as he begins his preaching, it's just after John the Baptist has been arrested for doing the same thing. Every time that Jesus preaches and teaches, everyone knows that the same forces that cut off John in his prime could rise up and do the same to Jesus at any moment. It's just a matter of time. Where is the God of power in the face of this threat of violence and evil? Where is the God who sweeps evil into the abyss with the flood of his holy anger? Well, perhaps the absence of such a God is actually at the root of the costly challenge we face during the journey of Lent. We're having to choose between two images of God, and they're both problematical. We can choose to believe that God has absolute power and is in control of everything that goes on earth, but those who suffer floods and volcanoes and massacre cannot be forgotten in that question. There was no God of power to rescue them, and our experience of God must answer to their experience. Alternatively, we can choose to believe in a God whose power is limited, a God who experiences powerlessness, a God who cannot respond to evil by just wiping it out with an act of power. God does not have the power to intervene in everything, to ensure that evil always loses and good always triumphs. The struggle over the nature of God's power is never simply resolved in the Bible. No simple one-sided God of power and might image is really available to us anymore. And there is that verse in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 13. It can be so easily lost when the rest of the chapter is taken up by the treatise on love. A verse that gives us encouragement to continue with our wrestling of the issue. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. During Lent, we have to wrestle with this painful dilemma for some weeks before we arrive at the revelation of how there is still extraordinary good news in this. As we struggle, as we move on, as we struggle up the hilltop of Good Friday to the Easter day of resurrection, we will discover the powerlessness of evil power. We will see that even when evil and hatred do their worst, they're not capable of entombing forever love and hope. God may not have the power to prevent evil from doing its worst, but evil does not have the power to prevent God's best. If I have to choose, I'd much sooner entrust myself to a God of suffering and new life than to a God of floods and earthquakes? Amen.